All right, it's 3 o'clock, so let's get started. Greetings, it's a pleasure to be here with you today for an informational webinar to discuss the BP Innovate Dear Colleague Letter, or DCL. My name is Chinonye Nnakwe Whitley, and I'm a program officer with the EPSCoR program at the National Science Foundation. I'm joined by my colleagues Josh Trapani, Andre Marshall, and Becky Shearman, who are also program officers that will present today. Today's date is December 18, 2020. And please note that information about this Dear Colleague letter is current as of this date. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and that we hope to have that available to those that have registered. During this webinar, we will discuss 4 key points. First, I will provide information about the BP Innovate Dear Colleague letter. Next, Josh will provide information on the Science of Science program. Andre and Becky will discuss additional considerations where we talk about the programs that are represented in this DCL. And finally, we will conclude with our suggestions for next steps. We will also have a Q&A session. Then at the end of the webinar, you can enter your questions into the chat window. We will read them aloud and answer them at the end of the webinar. This presentation will be available via YouTube, which we will share with you. The programs that are part of this call for proposals focus on areas of underrepresentation in which we invite study, though study in these programs is not required. They are tasked with funding studies of the scientific enterprise, national efforts to broaden participation, or efforts to build entrepreneurial ecosystems. They include the Science of Science program, or SOS, the established program to stimulate competitive research, or EPSCoR, the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Undergraduate Program, or HBCU-UP, the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education Hispanic Serving Institutions Program, or HSI, the Tribal Colleges and Universities Program, or TCUP, and the NSF Innovation Core Program, or NSF I-Core. So let's talk a little bit about the DCL. We envision a country in which the nation's innovators are globally competitive regardless of geography or background. However, as discussed in the DCL, the current landscape does not lend itself towards this vision. People with disabilities, racial and ethnic minorities, women, and innovators in certain parts of the country are an untapped source of talent needed to drive innovation and entrepreneurship and ensure the nation's prosperity. To increase national competitiveness and broaden opportunity for our nation's vast and diverse population of potential entrepreneurs, we seek greater knowledge of how disability, race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, geography, or other factors relate to innovation and entrepreneurship. The purpose of this Dear Colleague letter is to invite the community to submit research proposals that identify contextual factors and mitigation strategies to enhance the participation and the success of these underrepresented populations in STEM entrepreneurship and innovation. This is a convergent and multidisciplinary topic that encompasses the science of broadening participation and the social, behavioral, or economic sciences. This DCL encourages investigators to develop comprehensive research studies at this disciplinary intersection, and also to use the intersectionality of identities as a framework to examine interventions and phenomena within the STEM innovation and entrepreneurial space. It's very important that proposals have a social science research focus. That means social science research should be the core activity of the proposal. Workshops are also welcome under the framework of the Science of Science program and this DCL. As discussed at the beginning of this webinar, proposals should focus on populations, institutions, or geographies in which there is an underrepresentation in STEM innovation and entrepreneurship. As described in the Dear Colleague letter, we suggest different areas of focus, but your submissions are not limited to these focus areas as long as they include research that has a focus on underrepresented populations or entities in STEM innovation and entrepreneurship. But briefly, the suggested focus areas include research on empirical or observed implications of diversity on innovation, research on efforts to foster inclusive environments within incubators for startup companies, research that seeks to understand the impact of rural and/or urban networks on STEM education and STEM innovation and entrepreneurship, research that studies the financial and social capital barriers to STEM entrepreneurship, research that studies bias existing in venture capital or other sources of investment, research that studies mechanisms to democratize access to launching scalable businesses, typically in the form of alternative sources of capital, research that studies risk tolerance among entrepreneurs, especially those from underrepresented populations, and research on the influence of academic entrepreneurship on the educational experience, especially those from underrepresented populations. I'll turn it over now to Josh, who will discuss the Science of Science program.
Thank you, Tichi. I'm Josh Trapani, Director of the Science of Science program. In my few minutes, I'll talk briefly about the program and then tackle a few questions about BP Innovate. The Science of Science program is sort of new and sort of not. I say that because the program was recently repositioned from a previously existing program, the Science of Science and Innovation Policy, or SciSIP program. The history of SciSIP is pretty fascinating. I don't have time to get into much detail right now, but the ultimate origins of this program go back to John Marburger, who was director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, in the mid-2000s. He called for a new Science of Science policy to be developed by the scholarly community along with other stakeholders. This led to a bunch of activity by the federal science funding agencies, including the establishment of SciSIP here at NSF in 2006. The repositioning of the program occurred in 2019. The goals of repositioning were to respond to new and emerging areas of scientific inquiry, to help SBE researchers align their research with national priorities, and to articulate the value of SBE research to a wider set of stakeholders. The full name of the program was changed to Science of Science, Discovery, Communication, and Impact. I think it's important to keep the three nouns after the colon in mind. When I talk to PIs or read proposal summaries, I seek connection between the proposal and at least one of these words. So as you can see on the slide, the Science of Science program is designed to increase the public value of scientific activity. The program pursues this goal by supporting basic research in three fundamental areas. First, how to increase the rate of socially beneficial discovery. Second, how to improve science communication outcomes. And third, how to expand the societal benefits of scientific activity. That's the impact part. I encourage you to check out our program page, which I'll link to in my last slide, and to look at recent awards. Next slide, please. One thing you'll see is that the program funds awards through several different mechanisms. These include standard awards, dissertation research improvement grants, or DDRIGs, faculty early career development, or career awards, collaborative proposals, workshops, and a variety of others, including RAISE, GOLI, and the SciSit Bio program, as well as RAPIDS and EAGRs. It's easy to get lost in this alphabet soup. I know I'm still working to figure some of it out myself. A great reference to understand these different types of awards is NSF's Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, or as we like to call it, the PAPG. You can find links to the appropriate sections for each award type from our program page. Please look at the PAPG for guidance. I'd like to mention that a few of these types of awards don't require outside review, RAPIDS and EAGRs in particular. General advice for anyone interested in science of science, whether through BP Innovate or not, is to be very judicious about deciding to try to apply for one of these two types. Proposals have to meet certain criteria outlined in the PAPG, and most proposals do not meet these criteria. Proposals also have to be okayed by the program officer. My preference as a program officer is for as many awards as possible to go through external review and to be awarded through mechanisms that require it. Standard proposals, DDRIGs, and the like. Let me add that in Science of Science, we use a combination of ad hoc external reviews and panel reviews to make award decisions. We will be planning a panel this spring after the award target date in February. Next slide, please. I'd like to spend my last minute or two on some questions about BP Innovate. The most common question I've received is about award sizes and durations. Here, it is important to emphasize or reemphasize that BP Innovate isn't a new competition or a new program with its own budget, though I certainly hope it attracts new proposals and opens up new opportunities for co-funding. It's part of Science of Science, and because Science of Science gives out awards through the different mechanisms I just discussed, there is no one answer. I recommend looking at recent awards on the program page for general guidance. I have been asked if there are limitations on numbers of proposals per institution or per PI, and the answer is no. Are collaborative proposals across institutions or between academic institutions and other types of organizations appropriate? Yes, they certainly are. With respect to target dates, the key date to know is February 9th, 2021, which is also the next target date for Science of Science proposals. The application of this specific Dear Colleague letter to future Science of Science award target dates is yet to be determined. Next slide, please. Finally, here are some links you might find useful to our program page, to the PAPG, to the FAQ page about the Science of Science repositioning, and mostly for historical context, to the Marburger paper I referenced earlier. With that, I'll turn it back to Chi-Chi to discuss additional considerations.
So we don't want to be too prescriptive on the types of proposals that are submitted towards this opportunity. However, we wanted to point out that there are a variety of proposals that would be well aligned with this Dear Colleague letter. There's potential to scale existing research that exists in this space through this opportunity. We already know that there are projects within the PI communities of the HBCU UP, HSI, and TCUP programs that fall in this category and could leverage this opportunity to scale those efforts. There are also projects that may not require partnerships, but could generate new data sets or leverage existing data sets to conduct research in response to this opportunity. There are also research projects that might require partnerships in studies of innovation ecosystems like EPSCoR. As mentioned earlier, the DCL calls for proposals that advance understanding of how geography relates to innovation and entrepreneurship, which leads me to provide more information about the EPSCoR program. The goal of the EPSCoR program is to enhance research competitiveness of targeted jurisdictions by strengthening STEM capacity and capability. Currently, there are 28 eligible jurisdictions, as you can see on the slide, that are either states, US territories, or US Commonwealths that are eligible because they receive 0.75% or less of NSF funding averaged over 5 years. Of its 4 strategic goals, one includes investments in research capacity that will impact jurisdictional economic development. The EPSCoR program has 3 primary research infrastructure improvement, or RII, investment strategies to achieve this mission. This includes investments in multidisciplinary, jurisdiction-wide, state and federally sponsored projects to broadly develop research infrastructure and capacity. That's our track 1. Investments that promote collaborations across 2 or more EPSCoR jurisdictions based on a given topic. That's track 2. And investments that build up the STEM research workforce at the early career investigator stage. That's track 4. Proposals that focus on EPSCoR jurisdictions would be considered well aligned for this opportunity. I'll now invite Andre and Becky to talk about the EPSCoR program. Without mute though.
Thank you, Chi-Chi. As you think about the potential to scale your research activity, please consider the NSF EPSCoR program or others like it. This program provides a rich opportunity for BP Innovate partnerships and/or rich sources of BP Innovate datasets. The NSF EPSCoR program has grown into a national innovation ecosystem for the US. NSF EPSCoR has national impact on entrepreneurial education and economic development. With regard to entrepreneurial education, since its launch in 2012, NSF EPSCoR has trained a total of over 5,700 participants in over 1,900 EPSCoR teams. With regard to economic development, more than half, that's over 1,000 of participating EPSCoR teams have launched startups. These startups have raised over $760 million in subsequent funding. Next slide, please. These entrepreneurial education and economic impacts are realized, right there, thank you. These entrepreneurial education and economic impacts are realized through the program's focus on experiential learning and technology translation for commercialization. Deep experiential learning is driven through intense entrepreneurial and market validation training by seasoned expert instructors and rigorous customer discovery focused on exploring the commercial potential of the technology interest. Yet the program is more than learning. We are laser focused on technology translation and specifically commercializing deep technologies, as these technologies are those that have historically had the largest societal and economic impacts. I'll now hand the discussion over to Becky to provide additional information on EPSCoR.
Thank you, Andre. So the heart of EPSCoR is the EPSCoR teams, the faculty, the students, and the industry mentors. The National Teams Program supports approximately 300 teams a year, and regional programs offer smaller training opportunities that reach approximately 1,500 people a year. Through its intense experiential learning environment and close mentorship from knowledgeable instructors, EPSCoR can transform participants' way of thinking about commercialization and entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. There you go. So regional programs include 9 multi-institutional nodes and 99 institutional sites. Together, they create the National Innovation Network. The NIN is a large network of people, activities, and infrastructural resources that support entrepreneurship and technology translation. This dynamic network may serve as a source of rich data and/or partnerships for the research projects that are aligned with this Dear Colleague letter. Next slide. So now that you've heard the information in this webinar, please go back to the Dear Colleague letter and visit the Science of Science program page to make sure that there are no other questions that you might have. When preparing your proposal, make sure that you're selecting the appropriate funding mechanism for your project. Also, please remember to submit your proposal to PD 19-125Y by February 9th, 2021. You are welcome to start a few days early to make sure everything is submitted on time. If you find that you have additional questions, you're welcome to contact any of us regarding the pending proposals.